Just getting his last muffin there. Oh, all right. Good morning, everyone. Oops, there's an echo. Let's see if we can fix that quickly. Sure. Okay. So I can take a seat and then come back in. Okay. Okay. To those online, there's an echo. So we're just sorting out the issue. We'll be back in about 5 minutes or so. Okay. Thank you.
One, two. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. One, two. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2.
Okay. I think it's, oh, there we go. Sorted. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Let's, on that note, begin. I'm just going to ask those who are hugging and coming into the room if they can take their seats. We're going to start. All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning to all those who are joining us online. Thank you for being here today, for being part of this critical, necessary, this important conversation that's happening. It's not just important for journalism or for the newsrooms, but it's important for the protection of democracy at large. So I'm Liesl Wilson. I'm going to navigate this program with you today. And I'm just going to outline a few house rules before we get straight into the program. The bathroom is straight out the door on your right. So if you do need to find that, you can navigate there. And then if there's an emergency, please use the stairs. I've been told the elevator could be problematic, so you can use the stairs. And I think on that note, let's begin. So as you know, this conversation is happening at a critical time. We are obviously unpacking a new study that is looking at navigating risks and rewards, how South African journalists are using AI in the newsroom. It's a picture that's mixed with curiosity. It's a picture that's also mixed with caution. Why? Because it's already being used in the newsrooms for headline writing, transcriptions, for research. But there's still that element of concern when it comes to bias, when it comes to just issues of job security and of trust, which is fundamental for our democracy at large. And so as we keep the conversation going, it's something to ponder about, because it's no longer something that is happening to newsrooms. It's something that is happening in newsrooms. It's happening unevenly, and it's obviously happening without the proper guidance and infrastructure. And so this is really what the report is going to be delving into. And so as we look at this report, we obviously know this is not happening in isolation. Globally, this is a concern. Recently at the Digital Platforms Governance Conference that happened, there were engagements about AI, about the use of algorithmic systems in information ecosystems at large, and there were concerns about how it's evolving faster than what regulation can keep up with at this point. And so then this study brings some of those global concerns into the South African newsroom, and it looks at what tools are available and also just how it's happening in real time. And so as we look at those tensions, as we look at the importance of policy, of a newsroom culture, of training, of economic ramifications as well, and just innovation at large, I'm going to open this discussion by allowing Hendrik Sittig. He's the director for Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Media Program for Sub-Saharan Africa. Perhaps to frame the conversation, and then we'll get straight into that report. Hendrik, good morning and welcome. Let's give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you, Liesl, and good morning and welcome everyone here in Johannesburg and live online. Guten Morgen und herzlich willkommen, as we say in Germany. And of course, it's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of our Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and our media program for Sub-Saharan Africa here in this lovely venue. You know, we live in a time of profound technological transformation. Artificial intelligence is reshaping the media landscape with a speed and depth we have rarely witnessed in previous innovation cycles. This development carries enormous opportunities. AI can make journalism more efficient, more precise, and more diverse. Yet, it also amplifies existing structural challenges, from limited resources to political interferences, digital inequality, and the growing threat of disinformation. The study which we are presenting today illustrates impressively, and really impressively, I would say, how widely AI is already used in South African newsrooms. Often creatively and with curiosity, but still largely without systematic training, without clear editorial guidelines, and without tools adapted to African languages and contexts. Journalists recognize the potential of research, verification, and data analysis, while also seeing the risk of algorithmic bias and potential loss of audience trust. The key question is no longer whether to use AI, but how, of course, responsibly, transparently, and in service of journalistic integrity. At this point, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the authors of the study, Karen Allen, Professor Herman Wasserman, and Nande Mbekela. Their work combines academic depth with a clear understanding of the practical realities faced by newsrooms in South Africa. For our regional media program, this topic is of central importance, of course. Across the region, we work to strengthen media freedom, media literacy, and digital resilience, because free, independent, and trustworthy journalism is, as you know, of course, a cornerstone of democracy. The rapid transformation driven by AI touches all these areas at once. It demands new skills, updated ethical frameworks, and responsible editorial decision-making. That is why we aim to support newsrooms, media organizations, and journalism departments in integrating AI in a way that strengthens rather than undermines quality journalism. After the presentation of the study findings by Karen Allen, we will continue the conversation with a panel discussion where we will delve deeper into what the results mean in practice, especially in the areas of training, education, newsroom upskilling, ethics, and day-to-day editorial workflows. For the discussion round, we invited Patiswa Magupeni, the Executive Director of the South African Press Council, Mamaponya Motsei, CEO of the Frey College in Johannesburg, Lebogang Mokoena from Arena Holdings, and of course, one of the authors, Professor Herman Wasserman, the Director of the Center for Information Integrity in Africa. Unfortunately, he cannot be with us in person in Johannesburg today, but he is joining us online from Stellenbosch. Welcome, and thank you to all panelists for taking the time to be with us today. And of course, a big thank you to Liesel Wilson from the SABC. She will be guiding us through our event and moderating the panel discussion. So thank you very much to all of you, and I look forward to the presentation and our discussion afterwards. But before we start, we would like to show you the short image film of our media program. Thank you very much.
Yoda for Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. That video is just some of the work that obviously is being done around the world. And as it continues here in a sub-Saharan context, Hendrik, thank you for those opening remarks and for really unpacking what's expected for today for the program. And I should say Dankeschön, actually. Did I get that right? Yes. Yay. Okay. Trying to be contextual here. But without further ado, let's get straight into the program, the order of today. As I mentioned, today we're unearthing a report that has been released. We're looking at navigating risks and rewards, how South African journalists are using AI in the newsroom. I think the question that we need to look at is, are we in control of AI in the newsrooms, or is it already shaping us? And so I'm going to welcome Karen Allen at this point. Karen, if you can make your way to the front. Karen is the founder of Karen Allen International. She's a former BBC correspondent, and she's one of the lead authors of the study who's going to be unpacking this research. Let's give her a warm South African welcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Right. Hi everyone. Good morning. Guten Morgen. Herzlich willkommen. That's the extent of my German. I'm half German, but I always get ribbed for it here. So we're going to go through the presentation with you. It's not too long, but I'm trying to make it as informal as possible. But it's worth just reminding ourselves that newsrooms and journalism have gone through different iterations. And it's interesting to see some of my operational colleagues, former colleagues here in the room from ZDF and also ex-CNN. Because I'm old enough to remember the shift from typewriters to computers. Yes, I really am that old. Then came satellite dishes, followed by VSAT technology, which gave us the M4s and the portable BGAN satellite dishes. Now broadcasters use something called Live View, which uses cellular technology and satellites combined, or they simply stream via the internet. And you might remember that the war in Iraq in 2002 was really very much a testing ground for many of these technologies, particularly the BGAN technologies. And it ushered in an era of 24 hours news because we could do so much more. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, all of these iterations of technology assisted the news gathering and storytelling process. But they kept the information sourcing, the responsibility, and the writing, the responsibility of the journalists. AI can also do this, of course, by synthesizing huge amounts of data during investigations, but AI also has the potential to fundamentally shift the human dimension of news journalism. It has the potential of distorting sourcing, context, and facts, and it risks potentially eroding trust and credibility among the audience if we get it wrong. So that's the kind of doomsday thing. But actually what we really wanted to understand in our report, that you now have a shiny new copy of, I saw it about 5 minutes ago, so thank you very much, Herman. I'm very, very pleased to physically have copies as well. So the main idea of the report was to try and determine the scope of AI knowledge, understanding, and operational use, and the need for training. And I'm going to emphasize operational use because I was badgering Herman saying we must really, really do this study to understand what is happening in the newsrooms, not necessarily what's happening in policy circles. That is incredibly important because it provides the umbrella in which operational use happens, but what's actually happening at the front line, so to speak. And of course, we've already nodded to the fact that many respondents referred to time-saving efficiencies afforded by AI. But there is also some concerns and awareness about some of the dark underbelly or the unintended consequences of the technology. So how we did the study was to conduct, first of all, a survey. And I have to point out, journalists generally do not like doing surveys. And I can tell you that as someone from the newsroom. It is the biggest pain in the neck when someone says, please, can you do a survey for us? But actually, we emphasized how important this was for journalists to understand that if you want to get some training at some point, we need to understand the lie of the land first. Okay? And I think most people understand that we're actually trying to fly a plane and build it at the same time, to use that corporate analogy when it comes to AI. So we conducted a survey, which started with a questionnaire, and you'll see a copy of the questionnaire in the document. We granted them anonymity partly because we wanted people to be as open as possible, because there is this kind of shame, I'm using AI and I don't want my news editor to know. The problem is the news editor is probably using AI as well, doesn't want you to know either. So this was an opportunity for some really deep exploration to understand how it was being used. So we distributed a questionnaire to newsrooms across South Africa, and we really tried to get a spread between public and private broadcasters, also publishing houses, some digital TVs, and although many of the news outlets work across platforms, we asked people to give us an indication of what was their primary platform. So you can see the breakdown that we saw there. So we'd have a pretty good spread, I would say. You can also see that the vast majority of people who responded were slightly more older or experienced journalists, possibly because they have more experience with which to compare changes in technologies, the sort of changes that I just described at the introduction. Also, they're not necessarily digital natives. And so they've not necessarily grown up with technology generically. And so have an interest in understanding what is the new technology, what are the possibilities. And I remember having discussions with someone from the SABC who was saying she was learning so much about, from news interns that were coming in about new technologies, but actually they knew nothing about editorial content, and trying to balance the two. So I think it's very interesting that although this was a self-selected group, a large number of people were in the over 50 category, I would say from about 35 to 50, who were really, really interested. And you can see the breakdown of the different newsroom roles. The vast majority of people we spoke to were operational journalists. We wanted to speak to the journalists. We love to hear from managers, but we really wanted to hear from the journalist on the ground. Now, although the primary focus of our study was to look at the operational use of AI in newsrooms, we really wanted to try and get an understanding of what's the context in which AI is being used. And so we were asking about policies and practices. The vast majority of newsrooms do not have a policy. And that's not shaming newsrooms. It is just a reality. It is just a reality. There are other competing priorities. Only 8 respondents said their newsroom had an AI policy, including some kind of formal guidance. I say I'm not going to name particular organisations, but the SABC, because it's such a big broadcast, is a public broadcast that already has committees to start discussing these issues. And it's at corporate level where it is being discussed in many organisations. Why is that a potential issue? One of the things that came out was that some news organisations are talking about AI and AI use at a corporate level. They're not necessarily having the conversation about a newsroom level. So how you apply AI to your human resources department, or how you apply AI to finance, is entirely different, with entirely different risks and opportunities than for newsrooms. So there was a very, very strong sense that we need to have newsroom-focused policies. And why the urgency? Because journalism is increasingly revolving around data and technology-driven processes. So policies really badly needed to set the rules of the game and to provide a framework that informs use. Now, there has been some guidance and some references that have been presented by other organisations. The Poynter Institute, which has done a lot of work in this, which basically says that, as a rule, policies, AI policies, need to be rooted in principles of accuracy, transparency, and audience trust. And it's interesting if you look to Germany, for instance, public service broadcasters there have signed a code of conduct promising to only use AI where it adds value and not just for use sake, not just for its own sake. I'm going to touch a little bit on guidelines a bit later on, but let's keep going. So what were the primary uses of AI? Well, you can see sort of breakdown there. I know the slides are quite small, but just to trot through some of the different uses was confirming the authenticity of stories, so what we call verification. People have done things like reverse image search to understand whether images are actually correct or whether it's something that's been created by AI. For proofreading, incredibly helpful having another set of eyes across for transcribing speech to text. And this was, again, I spent a bit of time in the SABC newsroom, and this was being used a lot as a very, very helpful tool. For writing headlines, and it was quite interesting, one or two news editors kind of approached me quietly and said, actually, we're writing the headlines using AI, but, you know, and everybody's doing it. I'd also add to that reversioning, and what I mean by that is because now the speed of news is such, and the different platforms that you're having to service, you're having to repackage items and repackage news and repackage headlines and repackage them that are format sensitive. And so as well as writing headlines, they will be also used for writing straplines or for writing a brief tweet or a brief other social media post. Language translation, also a very big use that we're seeing across the board. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on because there are massive limitations within African context, and we've got some really lovely examples of where AI is letting us down. And of course, transcription services. So you get a clear breakdown there of the different types of use across newsrooms here. We didn't want to make this too much of a technically focused questionnaire, but we did ask what were the different applications that were being favoured. And it's interesting because there's two types. There's off-the-shelf AI, available commercially, and then there's proprietary, so AI that's developed specifically for a use within newsrooms. The vast majority, understandably, are using off-the-shelf models. I think I came across one journalist that said they believe their newsroom was using a proprietary model for one particular task. Now, it's interesting when you have a look at this, what's the obvious thing that stands out when you look at all those different applications? Yeah, but just in terms of who owns them, where do they come from? Okay, they're all what we might say global north. They're all largely the big tech companies based in the global north. These are imported models that we are trying to repurpose for use in a South African context. Gemini is owned by Google, for example, Copilot's Microsoft, ChatGPT, OpenAI. And with that come built-in biases and come blind spots, and particularly when it comes to context. But nevertheless, these are the models that are available for newsrooms, and these are the models that are being used. Now, we conducted semi-structured interviews with newsroom staff once we received the questionnaires back, and these ranged from editors, sub-editors, and reporters. And the vast majority of them were reporters or correspondents or sub-editors. We did speak to some of the technical teams, to VT editors, to sound engineers. But we found that the vast majority of the use of AI within the newsroom is largely for what we would say editorial functions. Okay, for researching stories, for preparing stories, for writing those stories. We also wanted to assess what their training needs were on the back of this. So we'll shed some light into that shortly. So what did the journalists tell us when we conducted interviews with them? Well, they were very clear that actually AI is a really, really useful time-saving tool. Journalism has gone through so many different iterations, but there's so much pressure now on journalists to be multi-skilled, to be able to service multiple platforms, to possibly not leave their desks and go out into the field, and to instead process more and more information. So most of the journalists talked about AI as a time-saving research tool. So what does that mean in practice? Getting up to speed just before an interview, understanding context just before you speak to someone, understanding the context. We would call it background reading, and in my day, because I'm a fossil, you would pick up the phone and you'd actually ask your interviewee, maybe we can have a quick chat about what this story is about and the kind of questions that would be appropriate. Another person said it helps to understand context before speaking to a newsmaker, and I think that's the reality, is we're not all experts, and there is so much time pressure on newsrooms to turn out material at speed because of the financial pressures as well, that AI really is incredibly useful to be able to do this. based on the material that gets spat back at you being correct and accurate. And one of the challenges, of course, we'll discuss this in more detail, is AI is only as useful as the raw data upon which it's been trained. Okay? And the reason why I showed you the slide previously is that those AI models that we're using in South Africa are based largely on data that is acquired in Europe, in North America, not in South Africa. You know, there are incredible innovations that are happening already within the IT space here, with people looking at trying to develop large language models which underpin the AI that can actually accommodate and can actually reflect a South African context and languages. But that requires huge amounts of investment, and the reality is we're just not there yet. It was also seen as a helpful creative assistance to try and understand unfamiliar subjects. Breaks down things when I don't understand the context, or when you're having to quickly turn around some creative material. Again, before we did this interview, the interviews for this, I had a conversation with an editor from one of the television stations. And she was talking about the use of ChatGPT for captions. She was talking about the need to turn around material very, very quickly and to do various different versions. If you think about someone who's doing a live inset, right? There may be we used to call it live and gratuitous at the BBC, when you're broadcasting probably about 12 hours constantly. There needs to be different creative strap lines or content that goes with that, that's refreshing and that's different. A lot of newsrooms are beginning to use AI to give them ideas as to how to refresh text or how to give new angles and new detail to a story. Again, it's only as strong as the data that underpins it. We've talked about the generation of scripts, intros, and stings. Again, from a technical point of view, a sting is a ta-da! It's a little junction. It's often an audio sting or a video sting that marks a grammatic pause or a bullet point on a story or a piece of news content or a broadcast when you're segueing from one story to another. So, you know, there is a hunger that AI will be able to do this more in future. People are playing with it. And that's the point, is that actually people are playing with it at the moment without much guidance. Journalists are also using it as a summarizing tool. So it means that those who write press statements need to be aware of keywords that journalists are going to be looking out for that get picked up by AI. So it's a double-edged sword. You get the PR companies that are beginning to write press statements knowing that the journalists are probably not going to read the press statement in full because they're going to use AI to track it and to read it. And they have a situation where the PR companies and others that want us to report on their stories will be looking for keywords that will get picked up. Problem with that is it often loses the nuance of a story, because if we're chasing algorithmic suitability and we're chasing keywords that make a journalist sit up and listen, it's amplified. I know, you know, it was always there before we had AI, that people wanted to write press releases for journalists that had words that you know that would grab their attention. But it's been amplified now by AI, because if journalists are using those very tools to be able to scan read press releases, those that want their stories on the news are increasingly going to be playing into that. It's also being used to develop an angle on a story, and I think this is quite interesting, because angles on a story are very nuanced and it requires understanding. It's an evolutionary thing. So if I'm doing an interview with Liesl, after about 5 minutes, I will possibly have thought about 3 or 4 angles after having that interaction. If I devolve that to AI, some of that nuance actually gets lost. But the reality is it's being used for this purpose because it is a time-saving tool. And I think that's what we have to keep come back to. So what are the opportunities for languages and translation? Well, multiple interviewees explicitly said they want locally trained models. I want to have a South African-built AI where it's multilingual, We will need African data sets that can handle our news content. There is an intrinsic awareness among most journalists that actually AI is not perfect. And the tools that they're being given in their newsroom are moderately helpful, but they're not context specific. And we had some really good examples of where my colleague Nandim Bekele was doing some interviews with some of the vernacular stations, and they've just given up on using AI because it just cannot cope with African languages at all. I mean, it can barely cope with English, to be honest, in many settings. So I think there was an understanding that people are having to constantly check the outputs that AI is throwing back at them. I think the drafting and proving scripts is especially important as a potential use for many South African broadcasters. SABC broadcasts in 14 different languages, including sign language, I understand. And so one's not going to necessarily assume that English is everyone's first language, and if you're broadcasting mainly in English. And so, you know, many senior editors were saying that they were using it just to kind of fix their English, just to make sure their communication skills were good. Now, that's a good thing if you're getting correct data back. It helps to give the news organization credibility and consistency. But again, whose language is underpinning the data? Which idiomatic expressions are underpinning the data? Because don't forget, particularly in broadcast media, it is a human-to-human engagement. We use language which is very, very different to, say, an academic text or written word. And there's quite a lot of scholarship that suggests that that human interaction and that journalistic human interaction is being eroded by AI if we rely on it too much. By all means, have it there as a crutch, but don't rely on it entirely, because the danger is that that interaction, and journalism is one of the deepest forms of human interaction, holding power to account, verifying facts, that risks getting lost. Okay, so what were the pitfalls? And we asked journalists how aware they were of the potential unintended consequences. They perform badly in vernacular languages. They repeatedly told us that specifically ChatGPT and other tools, they can't reliably translate isiXhosa, Setswana, isiZulu, Sepedi, etc. They just can't, and so they just don't bother using it, which I think is a good decision in the sense that better to discard it and dismiss it if it's not actually delivering than run the risk of having some very, very dodgy content that comes out. I had to write something recently, and I used to be based in Kenya, and I was checking some Kiswahili expressions, and I wanted to put this through a model, and I got Sheng back. Now, if anyone knows what Sheng is the street language. It's there's not something you're going to put in a broadcast. So there is such an emphatic case in South Africa for caution, for at this point in time, for journalists to understand the limitation of language translation. And you can see these were some of the responses from journalists who felt that it was really, really letting them down. And as I was saying, my colleague Nandim Bekele is on the call, so she may take a few questions afterwards if you wish. I think so much of our interactions as journalists rely on nuances and idiomatic expressions. And I think, particularly in a South African context, and particularly in a global context with the amount of societal divisions that we're seeing, this is a real, real challenge. And many of the journalists were aware of this. They're aware of misrepresenting political or cultural terms when it comes to coded language, xenophobic terms, or so-called dog whistles. That gets completely missed by AI. And these include languages or cues that are aimed at singling out particular communities. So I think, you know, this is a good finding of this study, is that there is an acute awareness that actually you cannot rely on AI totally in newsrooms for researching, but also for writing content, because some of that local nuance just gets lost. Again, it builds the case for local LLM models to be developed. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I really do want a chance to have some questions. But I've just given a quick overview of some of the pitfalls, and you'll see some of the quotes from the journalists, worried about hallucinations, worried about disinformation. And there's a lot of focus on disinformation at the moment. We've been doing some studies for Konrad Adenauer Stiftung on just AI-driven disinformation, and there is so much content that's around. People know what a deep fake is. They know how easy it is to just tweak something that is correct and throw it into the realms of being factually incorrect. So there's great awareness about hallucinations. There's great awareness about fabricated information. But there's also a real dependency. So growing dependence on newsrooms, on big tech platforms, potentially complicates the task of ensuring that new technologies work in the interests of those newsrooms. What I mean by that is newsrooms are increasingly dependent on these technologies, which are made by what I broadly call the global north, and particularly the case in our part of the world where there isn't a lot of money that's getting put into newsrooms, and we're increasingly having to look at cheaper and cheaper options. So I think there is a real concern of that dependency dynamics that we will say, okay, AI is not great, but we'll use it for our purposes. And if we get things wrong a little bit, better to apologize afterwards. Okay. But I think one of the things, and this really stands out, and this is where I do not mind sounding like a fossil. So many of the older journalists were talking about an over-reliance on AI and lazy journalism. And I say that without any affront to maybe a younger generation of journalists. But I think it can encourage journalists to take shortcuts, sort of creating bland copy devoid of human sentiment and ethics. I spoke to a journalist from a commercial broadcaster, 17 years experience, and she said, one of the biggest challenges is so much of the copy that I'm getting back from journalists, particularly from the younger journalists, it sounds like advertising copy, or it sounds like a copy that could be used to sell a packet of cornflakes. That actually, because of, if you've grown up with the use of AI, in, for example, in your university settings or whatever, and not actually checked yourself and gone back to check whether your copy actually sounds like a human being, does it actually sound like the SABC brand, does it sound like Newsroom Africa's brand, the risk is if that doesn't happen, and if there is an over-reliance, and some of that over-reliance is driven by time factors, I appreciate that, there is a real risk that there's very, very little distinguishing to distinguish journalism from creative content. And we know there's a world of difference. Many journalists feel strongly that if they're going to use AI in their newsrooms, they need to be much, much more transparent about sourcing. So if you're going to have an AI-generated image or an AI-generated map, label it. Label it as AI. There's no shame in it, but that transparency, remember I said it's one of the guiding principles that is informing newsrooms around the world as to how they use AI. So although AI does reference where it gets information from, and there is some research that people generally do go to a lot of the sourcing, the original sources, to get sort of original quotes, it's really important for journalists, particularly new journalists coming into the newsrooms, to understand that actual importance of sourcing. There's also a real concern about plagiarism. And we've all kind of had a copy and paste moment. I think, we'd be being disingenuous if we said we hadn't. But I think all interviewees emphasize newsroom norms about originality. And even though many are working without any kind of guidance, there is an understanding that you can't simply copy and paste from AI. We've talked about a decline in critical thinking and basic journalism skills. I worry that AI is not being integrated into basic news training at university level, but actually it needs to be integrated at newsroom level as well, because until you've actually been let loose in the newsroom, it's very theoretical. But I think at this point, understanding how AI is now part of the journalist toolkit, how it's part of how you put together a story, is something that's essentially needed at the university level. There is a major institutional gap in most newsrooms having policies that help to guide AI use and I'm talking about operational use. Some of the phrases that were used by journalists are that they're using it under the wire. They're using it secretly. There's a little bit of shame about using AI, but everyone knows it's kind of handy. Or journalists say they're feeling their way through, and I've used the analogy of building a plane whilst it's still flying. And this is really interesting. Most journalists who are using AI are self-taught. So they have someone at home, maybe a brother or a sister that's interested in tech, and say they've taught them a few AI tricks, or they're predisposed to being interested in technology, so they teach themselves, and you hope to goodness that that gets shared among the newsroom. But that is largely the way AI knowledge at this point is being shared among journalism peers. Which, if you think about it, on the one hand, it's great Ubuntu. On the other hand, it's blimming scary, because actually, it is fairly ad hoc. It's not systematic in terms of how people are learning how to use AI. Obviously, there is a bit of a blind spot among some people of not necessarily wanting to understand how AI works in a news context, because AI means job losses, doesn't it? It means we're going to lose our jobs. We're going to get replaced by an AI program. We might even be replaced by avatar journalists, and there's an interesting section in the report about the growth of avatar journalism. But there is a blind spot in actually grappling with this, and we've done some separate research not related to this, which really, really does underscore this point, that there is a fear to even talk about AI. It's a dirty word, because this is the thing that's going to take our jobs away. So, training and guidance. This is the light bit, the end of the tunnel, so to speak. We wanted to establish the level of AI training amongst journalists. And as I say, most journalists are self-taught. They're often relying on colleagues for support. 3/4 of all respondents confirmed they'd not received any formal AI training from their news organizations. And where there has been training, often it's packaged as cybersecurity training. Okay? Don't click on a dodgy link. That's malware. And AI is kind of added as a separate dimension, but it's been largely embedded in cybersecurity training. Others said that they've been exposed to some other vendor-driven training. I'm saying vendor-driven training now because I'd never used that word as a journalist, but now I'm in the policy world. We say vendor-driven training. Say it as Karen. Vendor-driven training basically means IT companies that are trying to sell you a product, and they'll train you on their product. So there are a handful of newsrooms that have received training from organizations like Microsoft that are pushing their own particular products. But again, it's not consistent, it's not industry-wide, and it is badly, badly needed. And I think one of the difficulties as management as well are also still trying to grapple with AI and what it means for their operations. One newsroom staffer told us that they'd participated in a 6-month Thomson Reuters Fellowship mentoring program. Thomson Reuters Foundation program, which supports AI adoption. They're doing really, really good work in this field. We would argue emphatically that you need to be context specific. You need South Africa-based journalists and African-based journalists working in African newsrooms to deliver training, because there are so many different challenges compared to what you will see in Europe or in North America. And increasingly, we're hearing about a desire for in-person practical training. Okay, I remember 10 years ago, you'd be given a CD-ROM to go and do hostile environment training or do computer risk training. I'm looking at my colleague here because we used to work together. And to get a journalist to sit down and work their way through a digital program is really tough. Most of the journalists that we spoke to said they would like to try and have some kind of in-person experiential training, so they actually can see AI use in the front line, in the field, so to speak. They want to see someone in front actually showing them. Now that requires newsrooms realizing that this is an urgent requirement, giving journalists time to be able to build that sort of professional development and understand possibly you're not reinventing the wheel. You can build on best practices from other settings. I'm going to finish in just a second, but I just wanted to give you the slide which gives you an overview of global best practices of AI in some of the world's biggest newsrooms. These conversations that we're having here are happening globally. Next week, I'm going to an International Journalism Festival in Perugia, and I can absolutely guarantee, and Isaac Manal's also going to be there, this will be a dominating feature because journalists are having to try and grapple with how do they use AI, what are the limitations. But there are some key principles that are underpinning the guidelines. Human oversight is absolutely imperative. This is calling human in the loops to make sure that actually humans are still involved, journalists are still involved in writing copy, in double-checking translation, double-checking sources. Transparency. If you're using AI, tell the audience that you're using AI and label some AI-generated images accordingly. Fairness in terms of use, understanding the limitations of AI and understanding where it possibly is not useful, but also understanding context and making sure your AI use is accurate. Again, on the regulatory front, one can talk about the need to have more guardrails in place. It's very, very easy to make an AI deepfake during an election in South Africa. I can tell you, because I did it with Herman. I think this is like technology's way of telling me it's nearly time to wrap up. But there are best practice guidelines that are being shared, and I think there is a very, very strong feeling among some of the people that we spoke to, particularly at the senior editorial level, that actually South Africa has got to be much, much more proactive in becoming part of some of those organizations, some of those conversations about AI. We've talked about the M20 in terms of making sure that, content is that gets effectively stolen by companies to feed their AI, that needs to be rewarded in some way. But also, more than anything, there are same conversations about accuracy, about context that are happening in an Asian newsroom environment. They're happening in Latin America. They're happening across Africa. South Africa, with a very, very vibrant journalism infrastructure, needs to be part of that conversation. So it's not just a recipient of AI, it's also driving the conversation, and it's also driving investment to make sure that there's AI that works for our South African newsrooms, that we're not just having to rely on what we're given. So best practice regulations, those are just some of the pointers as to the kind of key focus areas that should be being looked at. The need for common standards across newsrooms so that when AI use is happening, we're using it roughly in the same way, whether you're at the SABC or whether you're Eyewitness News or Newsroom Africa, or whether you're working for one of the big newspapers, and stronger protections for safeguarding sensitive information and tools when using AI. So our recommendations, just to wrap up for the study, there is a need for structural practical training for journalists, without a doubt. And I would argue emphatically that training has to happen, operational training has to happen concurrently with the formation of and to thrash out than operate. Better to have some imperfect operational guidelines based on what's happening in a wider journalistic ecosystem than nothing at all. And much as we are grateful for journalists teaching each other, it needs to be far more systematic. I think we need clearer editorial guidelines on AI policy for news. So I think senior journalists need to stand up and actually say, these are the red lines. This is where we will use AI, this is when we're not. And I think there needs to be an open conversation about people. People don't need to be AI shamed. Everyone's using it. Everyone's using it to some degree. So I think much more transparency is needed. And a development of AI tools that really are tailored to African languages. And we are beginning to see that. The study didn't look at that specifically, but we know that there are companies that are beginning to develop it. along with ethical frameworks safeguarding accuracy, accountability, and trust. And that, of course, means talking to the platforms, talking to the AI providers so that they understand what the limits are and refining some of those. And at that, I'm going to leave it. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we please get up for Karen one more time? Thanks, Karen. We're trying to fly the plane whilst learning to fly the plane here with the program as well, just because of the interest of time. We have to rejig it a little bit. So at this point, I wanted to open it up to the floor, perhaps to ask questions. But just because Professor Wasserman has to actually go, Prof, if you are online, so I'm going to halt your question session, Karen, just a little bit. And then Prof. Wasserman, if you are online, is he online already? Connected? All right. Prof.
Yes, I am. Hi.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I know that you were supposed to be part of the panel discussion, but you've got to leave shortly. So Karen has just given us a succinct summary of some of the findings, of course, the process as well, with the new study that had been unearthed. So I'm going to hand it over to you. Professor Herman Wasserman is the director of the Center for Information Integrity in Africa at Stellenbosch University. So he joins us online. He'll give us a short presentation, and then if there are any questions, we can give it to him. He has to leave at 11:30, and then we'll resume with the panel discussion. So, Prof, I mean, we've heard Karen speak about a plethora of issues, newsroom behavior, trust, verification. There's been language, the context in South Africa, as well as ethics, standards, norms, the issue of plagiarism, how we can't ignore that everyone ultimately is using AI at large, and then just innovation and adaptation at large. So I'm going to hand it over to you. Perhaps we can hear some of your remarks, and then we'll open up to the floor just before you have to skedaddle. So without further ado, let's welcome Prof. Wasserman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for not being able to join you today, but it was very good to hear my colleague Karen speak so eloquently about the study, and thank you also for the opportunity to conduct this study. I think what I'd maybe just focus on a few quick remarks coming out of the report that has been highlighted for us in terms of training and education. That is the space that I specifically also sit in as a journalism educator. And it is clear from the study, I think, that there are specific needs and quite urgent needs for training of journalists in this context of AI. So as Karen said, the report makes it clear that there are both risks and rewards in integrating AI into the newsroom. And this came out very clearly in our study, and Karen has highlighted these already. So maybe what I can say is to respond to those risks and those rewards from an education and training perspective. So the question I think that this raises, how do we educate and train journalism students, but also journalists, ongoing training for journalists, to capitalize on the rewards of AI that they have already identified. It is clear that there are some rewards and that they're already starting to reap them. But B, also train and educate them to avoid the risks and deal with these risks more responsibly. So one of the things that came out from the report is that the successful use of AI in South African newsrooms often depends on whether there is an individual in the newsroom who already has a keen interest in the technology. And often these individuals are self-taught, have taught themselves how to use AI, and they are prepared to share this with colleagues. So I think in order for AI to become a useful tool to advance journalism in South Africa, we need to change this. We need to capacitate more journalists, ideally all journalists, to understand the potential of AI and recognize its pitfalls. In other words, not only a few individuals who have themselves taken the initiative to educate themselves and to upskill themselves. So I think this understanding of AI, the understanding of it contextually, and the skills that are required to use it successfully has to be inculcated from a very basic training level already. In other words, it has to form part of journalistic curricula. We have to understand that when we train journalists at universities, there's usually at least a 1 year lag, but often a longer lag until they walk into the newsrooms. And by that time, the technology is already moving, as you've said, it's like a moving train. And we often find that when we educate journalism students, that we have to educate them for a future that we don't really know what it would look like. We have to anticipate that. So it's really important, I think, from that level already, make AI part of journalistic curricula, and that when they walk into newsrooms, they're already confident enough to start integrating AI into their practices. But as we've also heard, AI is also new for many established journalists. And so the prospect of integrating AI into their work can be daunting and intimidating. So training should also be aimed at established journalists. We cannot only rely on a young cohort of journalists coming through. We have to also make sure that established journalists in the newsroom and also journalism leaders are capacitated to use AI successfully and responsibly. So we have to build on their existing expertise and their experience in a way that AI can amplify that knowledge and amplify their journalistic values in a new technological environment. So let me look at maybe quickly at the two aspects. So if we look at the rewards of AI, so what our study finds is clearly that journalists acknowledge the practical advantages of AI in the newsroom, and they acknowledge this, and they also say that they are using this for many routine jobs. Often it is to save time, efficiencies. We know AI also is introduced into newsrooms and elsewhere. We should also make sure to recognize that it's not only in newsrooms. There are a lot of other people also using AI to create content. And that also increases the risks of things like disinformation and so on. But the practical advantages of AI in the newsroom include time-saving efficiencies, helping them research stories, verify content, and to reversion and translate copy. And this happens in newsrooms that are already under pressure, that are already often have problems with economic sustainability, that are low resourced, too few staff to meet the demands of the deadlines. So these decisions and this use of AI is done under pressure, various sorts of pressure. So how do we train journalists to maximize this potential? I would say when it comes to maximizing this potential, practical hands-on training is really important, where journalists are taught to use AI to do research, show them how to do fact-checking and use AI to sharpen those fact-checking skills, practicing their skills to prompt AI in optimal ways. So the prompting of AI is really important when it comes to LLMs, and to assist them with routine tasks like reversioning and translating. So that sort of practical hands-on training, I think, is important. And that training would draw on basic skills of journalism. Journalists already have to know how to research and to investigate stories and how to corroborate facts, and especially how to package and process complex stories into accessible and understandable stories for a broad audience. So using AI to improve those skills that they already need, can help them to speed up, can help them to be more efficient under these pressures, and help them also to maybe focus on the more creative and demanding tasks of journalism that AI cannot do. The sort of investigative journalism, the sort of person-to-person contacts, the sort of interviews, the investigative work, and so on. So this sort of training to maximize the rewards would require practical expertise and experience, and the ability to integrate basic good journalistic values into a new environment. So I will come back to that basic journalistic values when I talk about the risks. So when you look about the risks that are faced by journalists using AI, is also from the study, it's clear that there are several of these. Karen has already highlighted there's very little systematic training, there's a general lack of editorial guidelines and policies, and there's a dearth of tools adapted to African languages and contexts. And she's used the example of Swahili, but I think it's also the example in a country such as ours, 11 official languages. Clearly, these tools have been developed in other contexts. So the study shows really that many newsrooms lack this necessary foundations of training, internal rules, structures, awareness of risks, and largely also because these technological solutions are derived from the global north. So how do we train journalists to avoid these risks? Risks of disinformation, risks of using AI hallucinations, and also avoid copying and pasting basically a global north model. Again, I think this is done by going back to basics. We have to remind journalists of the importance of journalistic integrity. what is the role of journalists in this environment that's often inundated by information and communication and content? What makes journalism different from content creation? And what it makes it different is the ethical values and the journalistic principles. So coupled with the practical skills that we have to teach journalists, we also have to remind them and make them aware of the dangers of disinformation, information disorder, and we have to sharpen their knowledge of context. We have to understand, make them more aware that they work in this context and help them to develop their own responses, to draw from the cultural, linguistic, and social reality of South Africa and the richness that we have, instead of cutting and pasting from the north. So this sort of training, I think, especially will be important for journalists or in newsrooms to remind them of the sort of journalistic ethics, the theory, the history, and the context. And this is the sort of conceptual depth that I think that academic research can offer, to also help with comparative perspectives from elsewhere in the global south. So at Cinia, we value both these two dimensions of training and education, the practical, the based on experience and knowledge in the newsroom, but also the ethical, the theoretical, and the comparative. Some of the work we do, we work with fact checkers and teams from across the global south in our center. You know, we have a big project running with people from Latin America and the MENA region and so on. And it's really a big resource that we can draw on to also locate South African journalism and the use of AI in the South African context within the global south. So this is why we bring together researchers and trainers that span practical and academic knowledge and experience. So bottom line, I think from the study, it's clear that we need training, we need education from a basic level right up to working in established journalists, because AI is something new that also established journalists would need to be equipped to use. And this will require a multi-leveled approach to training. And, you know, I think this is sorely needed in the South African newsrooms. And I think this is the next step for us to concentrate on. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Prof. Thank you for weighing in there just on the importance of training and education. Just for the interest of time, we've got 5 minutes. So I want to quickly open it up to the floor. Does anyone have questions for Prof? Obviously looking at the importance of being deliberate, transparent, but also responsible. And so AI dependence versus AI usage or assistance. Let's see if anyone's got a question for Prof just before he has to go. Okay, there's a lady at the back. If there is a roving mic, I'm just going to ask you to hand it to her. Perhaps you can introduce yourself, in what capacity you're represented today, and then you can pose your question to Prof. Wasserman. Thank you.
I'm Ella. I work for the Campaign for Free Expression, and my question's quite broad. I hope I can get it across properly, so let me know if it's not clear. But
Thanks.
There are many AI models, some specialized to, say, draft legal papers or something like that. And I was wondering two things about this. One, is there a push for journalist-specific, data-specific, fact-check-specific, or whatever, a specific AI model geared towards journalism as opposed to generic off-the-shelf use? And then my second question is that there are many AI models and companies competing with one another. And a lot of these companies, especially ChatGPT, are facing resignations, boycotts, and whistleblowers over the fact that they have this incredible tool with the potential for growth and expansion, but they are developing too quickly, too recklessly, without guardrails, and they are trying to win a race with no clear aim or sense of the implications of safety. And I was wondering if you feel there is a need for newsrooms or institutions like SANEF or the Press Council to take a stance on the nature and development of an AI model, and when a model in its entirety is unacceptable or precarious to be used at all by a journalist because of certain corporate practices.
Okay, Prof, the floor is yours. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, these are important questions, and you know, they are also complex questions to answer. I think in terms of the first one, in terms of the what models exist or can potentially exist for journalism. I think that's an interesting suggestion. I'm not aware of specific ones that have been developed, but these LLMs, well, let me first say that some of these proprietary LLMs can be fashioned in a way that are more specialized for your own needs. So, for instance, you can create on ChatGPT your own sort of GPT that draws from your own research or your own previous stories, for instance, that uses your work as a specific source. And that's a way also to feed your own work into it and fashion it for your own purposes. So there are many ways of tweaking these models to be more specific to your own needs. I think I know that some of the companies like Media24 and so on are also experimenting with some translation tools, for instance, for Afrikaans, that there are attempts to make that more locally responsive, but it is still in the infancy. And I think this is where ideally one would want to move towards, where there is a model that is specific to journalists and that also can be trained in a way that is A, more locally sensitive and responsive, and B, also more trustworthy in terms of the sources that it uses to compute and to put things together. In terms of the guardrails and the dangers, I think we have unfortunately entered an era now where there is less pressure on these big AI companies to implement guardrails and safeties. There have been in the past, and let's call it by its name, prior to Donald Trump's second inauguration, there were much more pressure on them, and I think we have now entered, especially in the US, where these big tech companies are in a race to be first and not necessarily to be correct and factual and right, and that sort of race is now also being supported at the highest level, it's in other words also a political question. So I think it is important for journalists to be aware of this, to be aware that those guardrails to a large extent have been relaxed or maybe loosened, and that they tread very carefully. And this is why that fact-checking abilities, the sort of critical eye, is important for journalists as well. And again, to be reminded of the basic ethical and journalistic principles of integrity, truth, accuracy, verification. Although this technology is new, the values underpinning it, the values underpinning the responsible use of AI is the old values of journalism. There's the old adage, of a journalist, if your mother tells you she loves you, get a second source. So make sure that you corroborate, that you fact check, that all of these values are important. And this is also something we see, for instance, at universities, where often we find a paper with references that are hallucinated. These AI critical and skeptical of, for instance, image generation. So it's a long-winded way to say that yes, there are many problems in terms of the guardrails around these LLMs, especially, and one has to be careful around them. That doesn't mean that we can afford to avoid them. I think we cannot really afford to avoid them as a result, but we have to be very careful and critical in terms of how we engage them. Again, parallel to all of this, there is a big crisis of trust in journalism around the world. And journalism can simply not afford to undermine that trust further by the irresponsible use of AI. At the same time, we cannot stick our heads in the sand and avoid it. So we have to tread carefully between these two extremes.
Thank you, Ella, for that question. And thank you, Prof. Herman, for weighing in. I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. You're welcome to log off. I know that time is not on your side, but thank you for those invaluable insights. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. And sorry to have to leave you. It's just one of those days where a lot of competing imperatives. But thank you very much for allowing me to participate remotely, and all the best for future discussions and hope we can collaborate and discuss further in future.
Thanks,
Thank
Prof.
you.
Thank you. It's an ever-evolving conversation. And so as we continue to have that, we're going to rejig the program a little bit. Karen, I'm going to ask you to come back. She'll be part of the panel discussion that we're going to have. And then I'd also like to welcome Dr. Patiswa Mahupeni Changana, Executive Director at the Press Council of South Africa. Please welcome Dr. Patiswa as well as Mamaponya Mutsai, CEO of Frey College Johannesburg, and Lebogang Mokoena, Innovations Manager at Arena Holdings Johannesburg. A warm welcome to everyone. Let's give them a round of applause. Okay. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to start with Karen. I'm actually old enough to remember how we got to live stream and streaming, so I just wanted to put that out there. So I'm aware of, I don't know if I'm part of the old guard or new guard. I'm that bridge, perhaps, as a millennial. But thank you for walking us through the unearthings, really, of what's come through in the report. And I think the question I'd like to start off with then is just the issue of accountability and leadership, because with what you've now highlighted, I mean, if AI is being used in the newsroom, who takes responsibility at the end of the day if something goes wrong? What does it say about the state of leadership in the newsroom, in the country, and the continent, the world at large? That sounds like a thesis on its own, but good luck. Let's hear your thoughts.
Existential question. I've got the one that doesn't work. Sorry, I can shake with you. I think ultimately the responsibility has to lie with the editorial director, because I think, you know, if you have a tool that you know is going to assist you up to a point, but the reality is, yes, we have to have the conversations with the providers of the AI, but the reality is you are accountable for your newsroom, you're accountable for your journalists. And I can't overstate the point that Prof. Wasserman was saying about the need to go back to basics with journalism. And at a point when we're talking about this incredibly new tool and powerful tool that can assist journalism and can also impede journalism, it almost requires us going back to basics and to say, look, what's journalism more about? What makes it different from content creation? And therefore, you know, there is an accountability element which we often forget. You know, so if a journalist produces a piece of content that is AI generated and it isn't declared as such and it is erroneous and wrong, there need to be the same consequences for that newsroom as if someone libeled someone. You know, we get taught as journalists. The reason why we go to journalism school is we learn how to be safe, accountable, ethical journalists. You don't have that same responsibility if you're a content creator. And so ultimately, I think there is this sense that if we have a new tool, the editors do need to take responsibility. And that's why it kind of behooves our industry at the moment to really kind of grab the bull by the horns and to understand that we need to learn how AI can be used responsibly in our newsrooms, because ultimately, when things go south, the buck stays with us.
And it fundamentally also impacts on trust and democracy, which we're also seeing is part of the bigger conversation as well.
Exactly. Look, we had elections in South Africa a couple of years ago, and I was having an engagement with news editors, and we were talking about, you know, the use of AI, and we were talking about younger generations of newsrooms, and I've got nothing against a younger generation of journalists. You know, I've met some of the smartest people that are working with us, but it's you know, it's difficult. You need to have the models, the role models, not the LML models, the role models, the human beings that model what good journalism is about. And South Africa's got the most fantastic history of journalism. It, you know, it changes, it holds power to account, it creates change. And I think one of the things that one of the editors was saying to me is during the election, she had to explain to young journalists what an election was about. This was a journalist who'd come through one of the training schools, what an election was about, and what your role and responsibility was as a journalist to cover those elections, to cover the issues, to cover the ballot boxes, sort of to cover the voting day. And I think, you know, that is where we really have an opportunity, and I do see it as an opportunity to go back to basics and to say, look, you know, ultimately we need to better equip our journalists to be good journalists regardless of AI. AI is a tool that, in a sense, expedites that need, but it also is an opportunity to be able to use it as an efficiency tool, but to use it responsibility. So there's huge pressure now on editors to, you know, understand the breadth and the lengths that need to be gone to understand this new technology. It's constantly evolving, but I think this is a good first step.
Well, the only constant is change. And so we're going to
Exactly.
navigate that and see how that change of God also evolves. And so, Dr. Patisa, I want to then bring you into the conversation, because we're looking at the role of the Press Council at large and how it's adapting to what's happening in real time. Perhaps also just whether we are authors, or are we authors of AI-generated stories at this point, so that issue of plagiarism, originality, at the crux of what journalism is all about. How is the Press Council responsibly weighing in? Thanks.
I think maybe let me respond to the question that was asked,
Okay,
but
by
it was
Ella.
directed to Dr. Wasserman
Okay.
on whether SANEF and Press Council are working on anything. As we know, the current LLMs are open AI, which is macro. And it's always going to be a problem for journalists to rely on those tools. So we are already thinking about meso AI, which is going to be industry specific and focusing on journalism. And we are starting small. We are digitizing all the rulings of the Press Council with all the information they have and complaints, so from complaints to rulings. But we're also looking at bringing in all editorial policies that exist in the country and build a media ethics AI tool, but we need money for that. So there is a process. So, but beyond the meso, we also need a micro, which is going to focus on African languages specifically in the different categories where they sit. So there are the different levels that we need to acknowledge, and such that our interventions are targeted and address the problems that we have. So there is that process taking place. But to the point and to the question that you asked, I do think that we need to elevate our gaze from just the newsrooms and look at media owners, because AI is part of the architecture and it comes with risks. And we need to treat AI as a strategic risk like any other risk that a business has to deal with, because that means we need different interventions, because it's, in fact, I think of it as occupational risk. That is not just as narrow as health and safety. It's ethical, it's editorial, it's operational, it's psychosocial. So we can think of all the risks. There are many risks that come with AI. And until we treat it as a strategic risk, as media entities, not just the newsrooms themselves, but the people who own these entities must treat it and approach that at that level and bring the right training to the newsrooms that they actually run. Just at the level of digital maturity of the newsrooms, we assume that the digital maturity is at a level where we can deal with AI. Basic digital literacy, as defined by UNESCO, is not at the level where we should be, just as newsrooms. If you look at how it addresses the ability to access, to create, to manage, to evaluate, and doing so in how you treat your information safely and appropriately. So if we look at that, it means there's a level where all newsrooms have to take a holistic approach to digital literacy and not just focus on one aspect that's targeted at journalists or editors. And the fragmented approach that we see currently and stuff that's happening under the tables because there are no policies and it's this person experimenting here and there is reflective of how we are not treating AI and all other technological tools as risk to businesses while they bring rewards, but there is an element of intervention that we actually need to address.
Yeah, I mean, we can't be like an ostrich ducking our heads into the sand if danger's coming. And it sounds like a doomsday scenario in real time, literally, a horror movie at base. Karen, you wanted to respond to what Dr. Patisa was just echoing.
Yeah, sorry, just I'm in stereo. Just one point. I mean, I think the idea about risk, operational risk, is absolutely spot on. Just to draw an analogy, we all had to do hostile environment training. Okay, you get a bag over your head, you get kidnapped, you get taken away for a few hours and roughed up a little bit in preparation for a hostile environment that you may walk into. There is definitely an analogy with sort of AI training, if you like, in a more holistic approach, and I think maybe that's sort of a framing that we should think about in terms of how how it gets rolled out. I think one of the biggest challenges is that the types of AI is changing at such a speed. And, you know, yes, we want to be able to develop models that are context specific. One of the chicken and egg situations is you need investors. You need investors. And at a time when journalism is in crisis, you need to persuade investors why they need journalism per se. Not necessarily just why they need AI, good AI use in journalism, but why they need journalism as a good in its own right. So I think that's just the point I wanted to make about that analogy with hostile environment training and also kind of a more holistic approach.
Which also brings the cost element to the fore. And so, Lebogang, I want to then bring into the conversation because, yes, it's about innovation and moving with times, adapting. There's the skills and training that's also needed, the use of AI that could potentially reduce costs, but then there's also the issue of job creation and losing jobs at the same time. How do you weigh in on that conundrum? Facts and figures, number crunching. Go ahead.
I think we're in an evolution. The media right now, the newsroom, everyone, it's an evolution. So I think, as you rightly said in your presentation, and so did the prof, we're kind of finding our feet. It does cost a lot. I mean, even AI, the actual, to get the results that we need, bringing prompt engineering, the specific skill sets that you need right there, it carries a cost. So newsroom training is important. Ethical, whatever training is very important. We need to bring that in. And I think for us in the media, it's something that we in the organization that I work for right now is being discussed rigorously. Because there is that danger that when you move towards AI, people will lose their jobs. But we also need training. You mentioned during the presentation, I think it should form part of the toolkit. So I think if we was to give a answer to all of this, it would be, it should form part of the toolkit and it should form part of your training. And for us to survive, I mean, we're evolving, we'll see, and we will survive, but the economics of it and the cost of it need to be factored in as we go forward.
So then, let me bring Mama Paul into the conversation. Okay, sorry. Mama Ponya, if we're realistically looking at what this training is going to mean in real time, what do you propose when we're looking at those cost factors as well? How do we begin to mitigate against them, incorporate them, work alongside them, balance the figures as well? And even if we're looking at an African context as well, the issue of language came to the fore, understanding what happens in our own context, the idiosyncrasies, the idioms, the language, the expressions at large. Let's get your perspective.
So I think before we even get to the issue of cost, I think one of the first issues we have to address is the mindset that we have in the media industry. We're generally very resistant to change. We saw it with digitization. I mean, it was only until COVID that a lot of media organizations started taking their digital platforms seriously. Before then, even though it was very clear this is how it's moving, digital platforms were treated as the unwanted stepchild. Yes, you have to do it, but do the very least that you must do. And I think we have, generally from the work that we've seen, that attitude is the same attitude that we're seeing with AI, where there's almost a resistance towards embracing and engaging. How do we engage? And I think that's really one of the first things that needs to happen, is that we really need to have a mindset that is more embracing of change and more experimental. We want to experiment, we want to engage. And I think once we get there, then it's easier to deal with all these other issues that need to be dealt with. Because although, of course, there will never be a point where we're like, we have all the resources, we have, everything is perfect. But where there's a will, there's a way. And once we get to a point where, and I say this because maybe one of the things that's important to keep in mind is also remembering that the media landscape in South Africa is vast.
we have the very big media organizations that are doing very well, and often when we give examples, we talk about them. But the majority of our media publications are not that. They are local, small local media organizations. And so we need to have just a general mindset change where people are embracing this, because then we can do a lot more. For example, when we talk about training, you would not believe how difficult it sometimes is to get journalists into a room to do free training. And so sometimes we say resources, but actually resources is the next step. The first step is really, are we embracing this? And I say this because recently we were having a discussion about training with a rather big media organization. And when we were looking, it wasn't an AI training, but of course we want to talk about, so how do we bring AI here? And their response was, we don't use AI. Oh, okay, what does that mean? We don't talk about AI, we don't use AI organization. And they were like, we don't do it. And so we need to have that mindset change. And I think part of that is what Patisa spoke about holistic training. Because we've also seen that the organizations that embrace these changes better are organizations where there's been training on running the business side of media. Because often what happens is that journalists start media publications, but it's a different skill to write a story than to sustainably run a media organizations. So those media organizations that have been trained in how do I run a business organization, how do I run a sustainable, then they're able to think strategically about what does this mean? Who do I collaborate with? Even if I don't have the resources, who do I collaborate with to make sure that my journalists are getting this training, to make sure that I have these policies? So along with the technical training of AI, I think one of the things that is really important is a holistic training for the leaders in the industry, so that there can be a more systematic change that trickles down.
Yeah.
And I think maybe just to finish, I think one of the other important things to realize that also speaks to costs is collaboration. You don't have to do it on your own. This is especially true for the smaller organizations. We encourage every news media owner we work with, we encourage them, be part of an organization. Are you part of AIP? Because even if you don't have these resources, if you are part of a river that's already flowing in a certain direction, then it's easier for you to be part of the conversations, part of the resources. But if you're an island by yourself, it's a lot more difficult. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I have the unfortunate task of having to manage time. So, Patisa, do you want to just quickly weigh in before I open up to the floor? Okay, go ahead.
I like the reference to be part of a river that's already flowing. Because what it does, we already have a guidance note. It is not adequate because, as you have indicated, Karen, these devices or tools evolve like by the minute.
Yeah.
There's always something new. So we always have to keep up with the changes that are taking place. And in fact, one thing that I'm looking forward to is to get to a point we can deal with algorithmic accountability. Much as we say we use AI for writing headlines, writing interview questions, writing news angles and all of that, but do we disclose that information? Because there's ranking, omission, and framing that happens in that space. How do we deal with that to the extent that the public is aware of what we're doing in newsrooms? The other part is like your epistemic responsibility as a newsroom and as a journalist, because you need to accept what you don't know as a newsroom. And in fact, in the way we tell our stories, it's only when you are at a crime scene and you can talk about events as they play out that you can actually be as definitive as AI. But it tends to be definitive in areas where we should actually exercise humility and say, apparently, it seems as if, it appears as if. But in the way it frames things, everything is definitive and it's conclusive. So those are things. And in fact, from a point of view of regulation, we actually want to see audit trails of how the prompts have been done, to the extent that we're able to say, when we adjudicate, this is where the error comes from. And we expect that from newsrooms.
So it's about whether AI is making journalism more vulnerable or more efficient. Is the editor the journalist? Is the editor the algorithm? Lots of questions. So let me quickly open it up to the floor.
In fact, the greatest threat that we're seeing is global uniformity.
There we go.
Global uniformity, the nuance and the texture that comes with brilliant storytelling, is gone. Everything is bland. We all sound the same phrases, same everything. Yeah.
Well, not if it's up to people in the room here. It looks like they're still fighting for that justice. So I'm going to hand the mic to you, or if there is a roving mic at the back, perhaps you can just introduce yourself and then in what capacity you are here today, and then your question. If you can project, you can. It's just that there are people online, so it might be tricky. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi. My name is Adams. I'm with the CAST Regional Program for Political Dialogue. So you shouldn't be surprised that my question is around the politics of regulation. Beyond disclosure, beyond responsibility, and beyond the transparency of the use of AI, there seems to be, and I'm happy with, there's the director from the press council here, and there's also Karen, because there seems to be some skepticism when government attempts to come into the media space to sort of regulate. I say this because a few years ago, there was almost an explosion in Nigeria when the government tried to commit itself to regulating, to an extent, social media. And, media houses, came up with, this is an attempt on hindering on freedom of speech, and all of these narratives, which is valid. But now we have competent representation from the panel, and I want to get your insight on your standing on the growing conversation around government being the most competent body to actually bring in regulations with teeth. Because we can speak about, like I said, the responsibility of these models. We can speak to the transparency. We can speak to the disclosure. But at the end of the day, the presentation by Karen was quite apt, because there's clear risk and challenges, but the risk seem to be growing. Yeah. So, what is your opinion beyond the skepticism of politics and politicians with regard to the involvement of government at the highest level to really bring this under an umbrella, from a place of, okay, we can have confidence that there is a higher authority,
sure,
with teeth to kind of bring this all under control.
And to his point, it's happening in real time. So the pace at which this is happening, the issue of jurisdiction as well. Is that a question you want to pose to Karen or to Dr. Patiso? Okay, to both. Okay, you've got a mic, Karen. There you go.
So I'll keep mine really brief. Okay. Two things. I think it's self-regulation. I think it's industry regulation, definitely not government regulation. I've just come back from Uganda where the internet was switched off, and every possible image of the opposition was claimed as a deep fake. I also think there's a concept, and you'll know this concept as well, of the liar's dividend. The liar's dividend is basically governments basically claim, and it's not just governments, it can be anybody that is supposed to be held accountable. You claim everything is fake, everything is AI generated, even when it's not, even when it's the product of robust journalism, and it's used as a tactic to evade accountability. So I strongly think government should have nothing to do with this. We have, we have broader legislation when it comes to AI use, across the board. The African Union's doing this. We also have a sort of AI strategy in South Africa. No problem with that. When it comes to journalism and the fourth estate, I think it needs to be self-regulation and it needs to be industry-driven.
I'm going to echo what Karen has just said. You don't want to find yourself where the statutory regulation where media is concerned, whether you're talking about platforms themselves, because that's media. In fact, those platforms have become distribution channels for news content. So if you're not careful and you think that you want statutory regulation for them, you are going to end up with the same problem that the media is trying to avert. So the idea that you made reference to Nigeria is interesting because we've seen recently in Kenya with the Gen Z protests, we've seen this in Tanzania. And in fact, being part of the network of independent media councils in Africa, we are driving self-regulation for the sector because we know the dangers of statutory regulations. And it's not only that, it's also protecting the free flow of information where the public is concerned, because you know what governments do when they want to control what the public can consume. Much as we also think of the rights of the public that must be protected, we also think of those who are actually actors in providing information, that the freedom of expression must not be suppressed. So we would advocate for rights-based governance and not statutory regulation.
Okay, Rebecca, I can see you also have a question. Yeah,
I do. My question is for Libo specifically. You are driving innovation at Arena and you have a lot of newspapers or publications in your stable. How does that look, especially considering that you have different audiences for all of these, but also what has been the response of your audience to your use of AI, if you have already done so? And are you worried at all about your credibility, right? As somebody who is in the media space, even I get a bit overwhelmed and I get a bit frustrated at, whether or not I can tell whether something is AI produced or not. And that's something the general public is battling with at large on social media, online generally. So are you concerned that implementing it too quickly might affect your credibility? Are you concerned that the uptake being too slow affects how you integrate into how people consume media these days? Yeah, but mostly I'm concerned about your credibility, the trust element between your audience and you when you integrate AI. Yeah.
I think that's the big question. We are battling with that right now. We engaged very robustly because when you also declare that you're using AI, there's the trust element that comes in there. We speak about AI bias, algorithm bias, and such. So will the public pay? Because this is a business again. Will the public pay when they know that you're using AI? Because there's that conception that AI is free. Well, the majority of them, they're free and you can get free information. So if this news is generated or enriched with AI, should I be paying, and should I be paying this amount? So there's that. And I think also there is a place for AI. I'll specifically say if you look at data journalism, if you look at information that looks at business, a SEND statement comes out, it's formulaic, it's always there, it's always written as such. That can easily be generated into an AI piece because this information is structured, you can get it where you get it, that you can send out, that has no problem. But if you want to do a story about a famine or people being killed, a protest as such, you need that emotive reporting because after all, communication hasn't changed. News is still fashionable. It's just that how people ingest it is quite different. They'll prefer a tweet over a deep thought piece about something. So I think to say we are implementing it, we are talking about implementing it, but where we're implementing it is the big question right now. It's quite easy, as I said, to do it in data journalism because that's quite simple. But when it comes to real stories, stories that grab people, stories that really move the needle, that's where you need a human in the loop. And that's where we are right now, to interrogate this very thoroughly before we make it known. We have a policy, but again, they spoke about declaration. I think when you use it, you have to declare always, so that the reader is informed and the reader is educated and they know how to interpret news that is AI influenced or AI enriched. With data, no problem, but with the human side, I think there's a deeper conversation that's still happening there, and in the media we engage in that right now.
Okay, there's another question. Thanks, Rebecca. If you can just pass the mic. You can introduce yourself, and then you're welcome to say in what capacity you're in, and then who you'd like to pose the question to. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vix Applebaum from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, so not from the media space, but from the educational space. So I wanted to also ask more generally to all of you, anyone who has an answer to this, what is the role of journalists in also educating the public about the use of AI in newsrooms and how it's being used? How AI would function in that space. So how do we then actually get the general public to have any form of trust in the media? If suddenly you slap an AI generated label on it, great, then people are going to, every time they see an M dash, think everything's AI generated. It's more about the transparency of how it's utilized, I think. And I think maybe the media also needs to think about its role as an educator in how it functions. Yeah.
Thank you, Vix, for that.
So that I'm not blocking anyone. My name is Kelly. I'm from Meridian 17. In terms of who's using AI and how they're engaging with it. And then just two quick comments. So I had a question about local journalism, so I'm really glad you brought that up. Thank you, because I was wondering how that fits into the space. And maybe another question, but around, you mentioned the fragmentation of the implementation of the use of AI. Is there some kind of awareness of what I feed into that then trains the model and kind of the protection of the data and the information that is fed into the AI tools that are being used? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. So it was broad, so anyone can answer that. And then also just in wrapping up, perhaps you can give us your thoughts on, if we get this right, what AI is then going to look like in 5 years, but then if we get it wrong, what is that doomsday scenario? Maponya, let me start with, and then we'll go down this way. Thanks.
Thank you. On the question about educating the public, I actually was thinking about that as you were responding, because we take it for granted that our audiences are having these conversations that we are having. But actually, UCT did a study, I think 3 years ago, it was saying that 73% of South Africans have no idea what AI is, like they don't know. And last year, they were saying 1 in 3 South Africans don't know what AI is. So part of what we need to do is when we are disclosing, is disclose exactly what we're saying. And we've seen this also in the media industry, that someone would say, I don't use AI, but I use spell check. So even there, defining within our industry, making sure that everybody knows and we are working together, and we are also, because it's an experimental thing where we don't know, but we're also seeing what our audiences then, how they understand this and how they receive it and what that means for us. I really like what Patricia said about not having this conclusive statements and saying, we don't know. To be done about educating and making sure that we're working the same mile with our audiences. And as for 5 years, I feel like 6 months.
Okay,
let's
bring it down to okay.
Is a long time, given how quickly things are changing. I mean, I'm not sure I can say what it will look like, but I think I can say that what is unavoidable is that we will have to engage. And my hope is that, I mean, one of the things as I was reading the report, I thought, oh, it's so unfortunate that someone from the SABC said that, oh, this is very, we have limited use. Because I would think that the SABC has a gap here in terms of language, because they have vast amounts of data and they could experiment. So I hope that we do have that, where in the media industry, we're not just playing catch up, but we get more excited and we're like, what can we do and how can we get on top of this for our audience's sake. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, I think for me, the point that was made about education again, and where the public is concerned is quite crucial. But if you have the likes of the SABC, which is a public broadcaster, with all the audiences that it has across its platforms, not doing that. But again, it goes back to digital literacy generally in newsrooms, that you're not going to be able to achieve that when people who are sitting in the newsrooms still need to be taught themselves how the tools work. But it is mandatory for the SABC to actually provide that as a public broadcaster. Not that other entities shouldn't, but they have a bigger responsibility to make sure that that happens. So that's one part. And I also think the level at which we admit the automation of editorial judgments is something that we need to acknowledge, because newsrooms are now diminishing in their role as communities of inquiry, because we are relying on these digital tools to actually make decisions. And this is where the issue of editorial independence comes in. We speak with authority where editorial independence is concerned, where politics, where commercial interests and other interest groups are concerned. We're not saying anything about technological vendors and their influence on how editorial decisions are shaped. And I think it's something that we need to carefully look into, because it's going to be a big issue as we go, because these vendors actually have geopolitical interests. Can you imagine writing a headline using AI with what is currently happening in the Middle East, and how that would be framed and what's going to be omitted, and the information that's going to rise up in terms of how you use your AI. So these are editorial decisions and the independence that we always claim as journalists, but where AI is concerned and all these technological tools are concerned, we're not thinking of them as influencing our editorial decisions. So it's something that we need to think about.
And unfortunately, I can assure you that's probably already happened. But we'll leave it there for now. Lebogang, do you want to weigh in? And then I'm going to give Karen the final piece as we wrap up. Thank you.
Sure. I think when it comes to educating everyone, we also need to, I mean, I was having a conversation with a colleague earlier. AI is very broad. And I sometimes think that when we paste AI, the tag AI on everything, that's kind of missing it. We need to be very clear on what AI is. There's AI that can achieve this, there's AI that can achieve that. So I think when it comes to educating, we in the media, we assume that we're educated, but as the results that were shown here, it's very fragmented, the application of it. There are those people that are very pro-AI, and there's some people, well, the older generation mostly, who are very anti-AI. And then there's the incoming cohort of young journalists who are extremely AI and sometimes provide that bland copy. So I think we need to educate, one, on what exactly is AI and what this AI is aiming to achieve. So another thing, trust. When it comes to trusting the media, I think having this uncomfortable conversation, that's where it starts. A lot of the advancements in journalism that we've had have come from these uncomfortable conversations as to whether are you using AI and to what extent, and which AI are you using, and the mechanics behind it. That's where the bias comes in and everything that's attached to that. 5 years from now, I'd say 5 years is a very, very long time.
We reduce it to 6 months, thank you.
It's a very, very long time. I was having a conversation with a data scientist not so long ago, and he said that, I mean, the stuff that he learned in first year, by the time he graduated, is outdated. Sure. So to say that where journalism and AI would be in 5 years, I don't think anyone knows right now. But what I can say is we are preparing for that future by conversating, by experimenting, and by understanding what this AI is. And just a parting shot, I think another important thing when it comes to AI, the prof mentioned this, is the power in prompting. Because I'd say that AI is really garbage in, garbage out. If you're going to be very broad in what you ask AI to do, it'll give you a very broad and sometimes a misguided answer. So once you understand the basics of what prompting is, the results that you get from that AI will be much richer, and I know it will benefit the reader at the end of the day.
which is just a mirror for who we are as a society. And that's probably a whole nother philosophical conversation. So Karen, it's over to you as we wrap up, and then we'll get some closing remarks at the end from me.
Yeah, I'll try not to repeat some of the points that my colleagues make. But in addition to the issue about educate, I also would use the words differentiate. What do I mean by that is differentiate journalism from content creation. And I think Lepeng made a really, really interesting point about the disclosure. Will people be prepared to pay if we disclose that we use AI? I feel one of the most important things that we need to really push to the forward, who is driving this conversation? Is the conversation about AI training and AI use being driven by advertisers, being driven by vendors? And that's where the differentiation comes in. You know, if ultimately it's okay to use a bit of ropey AI because you get your content out quickly and you're competing with maybe a digital platform, doesn't that effectively reduce journalism to nothing? And ultimately, we will be replaced by avatars. I'm sounding really doomsdayish, but if we use the 5-year projection, avatar journalism, I think, is going to be, because it's very, very cost effective. And we're already seeing it in Zimbabwe. We're seeing it in many, many other parts of the world. And we're seeing it for positive use. We're also seeing it with nefarious uses. But I also think, you know, there's a wonderful opportunity at the moment. The very fact that we're talking about this now has to be a positive thing. There's already good practice that's being discussed around the world, and I think, you know, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. I think there's definitely context-specific conversations that need to happen, but I think there is a growing corpus of understanding about what AI means in a newsroom setting, and there are enough commonalities for South African journalists to be able to draw on that, and for us to be able to build kind of a really strong, sort of reasonably safe sort of AI toolkit to say, at this point in time, this is what we're learning from other news organizations, albeit with various caveats. So I'm pretty optimistic, although we've painted a picture of kind of, you know, we have to wake up, and I think we have to wake up and smell the coffee, and we can't wait for the policies to put in place. I think there is an opportunity to be able to harness kind of the global community of journalists and to be able to make it work in South Africa.
Thank you. It's to your point as well about the socioeconomic dynamics as well in a country, education levels, literacy levels, the language use, the demographics as well. And there's so much more. So we have to leave the conversation there, but yeah, we're going to continue it over coffee. We have this venue until 1 o'clock. So as we wrap up here, please continue it. Ask more questions. Karen is here, Patisa, Mamoponya, and Lebogang. They're here to engage and obviously take some of your suggestions as we try and look at the possibilities and the probabilities of where we are and hopefully where we navigated as we look at journalism and what the future looks like. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of you for being part of the discussion. Thank you to our online users as well for your patience in rejigging the program. As they say in South Africa, fleet, my story is 8. I'm going to drop the mic here and we'll see you next time. Thank you.